Peter Charles here, Hooked Fly Fishing. And today let's take a look at what's involved in casting a tight loop. And you don't always have to cast a tight loop. It's not mandatory, but they are valuable in both accuracy and distance. So it's good to be able to cast a tight loop when you have to. And of course, it's great for style points too, right? So let's take a look here and see what's involved in trying to get off a good cast with a nice tight loop. Now, we've talked about this multiple times about a good forward stroke. And in that forward stroke, that's essential for that tight loop. If you have a poor forward stroke, you're not going to get it. So it's fairly common that you hear people talking about a high stopping position to create a tight loop. And that's true. That helps. But it's not necessary. That's the interesting thing. It's more about your tracking that causes the tight loop, not just a high rod stop position. So here's a stop position. I get a really nice tight loop. That's cool. But now I'm casting a long belly, and I'm using a relatively low stopping position, but I still get a tight loop out of it. And you can see this sideways shot shows you what that line looked like. Different days, obviously, different situation, but it's the same rod, same line, same cast. And you can see what that cast looked like going out in terms of the forward loop, and you can see what my rod position looks like. It's, you know, just a few degrees off of horizontal with the surface of the river. So that was basically my stopping point. So how did I get a tight loop with a low stopping point where it seems that high stop is mandatory? Well, there are some issues there, and we'll look at a couple of things here that go into making a tight loop. Now, we've seen this diagram before in a previous video, and you can see where the placement of my arcs are. The green arc is more or less ideal. That's a typical casting arc for a short head. The red is what you don't want, and so the more the red gets tilted towards the horizontal and away from the vertical, the more open your loop will be. So if you want to cast an open loop, all you have to do is basically move your casting arc a little bit closer to the water, and you will get a nice open loop, if that's what you're looking for. Okay, now why would I want to throw an open loop? Well, if I was, say, for example, fishing in the Spey for Atlantic salmon, I was throwing a small Atlantic salmon fly, and I was casting into a glassy pool, a tight loop may smack the fly into the water a little hard and scatter fish. So that gentle layout from a wider loop might be a better idea. So you want to have the ability to do it at will. Throw a large loop, throw a narrow loop, and you make the choice what's required for the situation. Now, in this particular diagram, that's basically what I'm going to be doing with a short head line. With a longer line, what you saw in the other image, is my back cast is almost flat with the water, and when I finish up, it's also almost flat with water. And you can be wondering how the hell I get a tight loop out of that, but we'll get into that whole idea of the way the rod tracks to deliver that tight loop. So there's a big sloppy loop going out on that cast. So here's a nice tight loop, and we'll stop it right there. The green line represents the vertical height. So this represents vertical height. The red line is the curve of the loaded rod. So there's the rod tip right there. And this is the key part about the ability to cast a tight loop, is where is your rod tip at that moment in relation to where it started and where it finished? And that's the secret why I'm getting these tight loops out of a very wide, low lung belly cast. And the reason is, as I'm coming through, my hands are dropping really low, which brings the rod tip down, plus it's deeply loaded, and then I come back up at the end. And as a consequence, my rod tip is going pretty well in a straight line. And this is what I'm doing here with that, because you have to account for the bend of the rod when you're trying to make this kind of assessment. And now you can see the difference in the vertical height between my maximum height of my rod and my stopping point. And so the maximum height is right here. So that's basically the maximum height of my loop, right there. But it is going to be smaller. And the reason for that is that the line as it rolls out, we'll stop it right there, as it's lifting the D-loop off the water, it tends to compress it. So I've got that, I'll back up there, we'll look at those lines again. So you can see in that diagram right here, you can see the D-loop is coming off the water, and the weight of the line in the D-loop is going to actually pull that even tighter. So despite the fact we've got, a gap between the vertical heights of about that much, the loop gets even tighter because of the compression of the weight of the top of the D-loop, pulling things down. And so you get this needle nose loop going out there. So let's take a look at this one. Boom. And you can see the tight loop that's being delivered. So really, when you're looking at my model here, when the rod is loaded and you're going through this arc, the deepening of the load of the rod is reducing that difference in height between the maximum height of the rod and the stopping point. And the closer you can get those two things together, the tighter your loop will be. And as I say, I'm achieving this in long belly casting. So I'm right back here. And then as I come down through my arc, not only is the rod loaded and bending, my hands are good and low. And then I finish up stretched out with my rod back high again. And I've tracked my rod tip more or less in a straight line, and I produce a tight loop. So you can produce a tight loop with just a high stop and reducing the vertical height of, the difference between the maximum height of your rod tip and your stopping point. The closer those go together, the tighter the loop. The further they are apart, the more open the loop, but you can achieve the same thing even with a very broad, flat stroke that will still deliver a tight loop. Just by keeping that in mind, you are managing that difference even with those long belly type strokes. You're still managing that difference between those two vertical heights. And the more you can compress them, the tighter the loop. And that's basically it. Now, keep in mind, everything else I've said in previous videos has to hold true as well. I mean, if you've got a very sloppy forward cast and a bad D-loop, you're not going to get a tight forward loop no matter what you do. So it all has to go together in one package. But if you, as I say, the more you compress the difference in those two heights and reduce the difference, the tighter your loop will be. So give that a try. Cheers.